Les habla Pocho Salcedo y damos la bienvenida a nuestra audiencia en Latinoamérica y de costa a costa aquí en los Estados Unidos continental y en Hawái. Una vez más, explorando con ustedes el ADN de las noticias regionales e internacionales. En los últimos meses, los titulares sobre el descubrimiento de restos sin marcar en los sitios de las escuelas residenciales han consternado al público en general en Canadá y alrededor del mundo. Pero ese episodio es solo una parte de una injusticia multigeneracional que ha sido descrita por algunos como un genocidio o como verdaderos campos de concentración. Se cree que alrededor de 150,000 niños indígenas han asistido a los internados financiados por el gobierno y administrados por instituciones religiosas. Las escuelas existieron durante más de un siglo y fueron diseñadas específicamente para separar a los niños de sus familias y su cultura. La última institución fue cerrada solo en 1996. Miles de sobrevivientes han descrito abusos físicos y sexuales aterradores. Este es un programa que nos llenará de tristeza, pero también de esperanza. No lo podrán olvidar muy fácilmente. Desde London, Ontario, Canadá, tenemos como invitado a un experto abogado especializado en temas de reconciliación nacional y derechos de los pueblos indígenas. Rolando Aguilera, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much, Mr. Salcedo. It's a pleasure to be here with you and with your audience.
Rolando Aguilera is the son of immigrants who arrived in Canada at the outset of what would turn out to be a 12-year civil war from El Salvador. During law school, Rolando focused on the rights of Indigenous people under the Canadian Constitution and worked on modern treaty implementation in British Columbia. His interest in the Canadian Truth Commission and its treatment of the Indian residential schools stems from his study of the Truth Commission of El Salvador. He actively participated in truth commissions in Latin America and Europe.
Well, let's start from the beginning. What were the residential schools, how they became into existence, and why were they created, and for how long they operated?
Thank you very much. There's a lot to cover in that question that is likely of interest to your audience. The Indian residential school started as a project, if you want to call it as such, for the purposes of assimilating Indigenous children into the predominant Anglo-Saxon society in Canada. That's kind of a nice and flowery way of putting it. Some of the language by policymakers and lawmakers at the time the purpose was to kill the Indian in the child, or to have Indigenous children adopt, quote, the modes and habits of thought of white men, end quote. So really it was the purpose behind it was to take Indigenous children from their families and their communities with their own cosmologies, their own languages, their own traditions, and to assimilate them into this predominantly European society that was settling in Canada at the time. This project starts before the creation of Canada, which is 1867. And it's led by the various Christian denomination churches in a ad hoc kind of fashion. No funding from the government at the time, which would have been the colonial government of Britain. And so leading this project on their own. It's only in after Confederation in 1876 and more closely to around 1880s, when the formalization of funding by the federal government, which is now the government of Canada, is financing the respective churches in carrying out this project that I mentioned earlier.
How is the Indian Act connected to this whole process?
Thank you. Yeah, that's an important question, and it may be very a unique dimension for your audiences south of the border in the United States and in the Americas. It's a really unique piece of legislation that really formalizes this assimilative project. The Indian Act is enacted in 1876, And included in the Indian Act is the requirement at some point in time that children attend these residential schools. They're obliged, they're required by law. And so we have children who, between the ages of 4 and 16, if I'm correct, who are required to attend an Indian residential school at the potential penalty, so fines for not complying with the provisions of the Act, and then subsequently potential imprisonment. And we're talking about the parents, not the children, because the children were going to be taken in any event. But so really the Indian Act mechanizes through law this assimilative project. The Indian Act in 1876 is really the culmination of a series of pieces of legislation going back to the 1830s that deal with Indians. And if you look at the earlier names of those acts, one of them is called the Gradual Civilization Act. So you get a sense, you get an understanding of what is the kind of thinking at the time that eventually formalizes this process of the Indian residential schools. So as I said, the formalization of this happens around the 1880s, when the first Prime Minister of Canada commissions a report, which is called the Davin Report. And that report is the culmination of efforts by Canadian bureaucrats to go south of the border into the United States and examine what the United States was doing with the indigenous population there. So they were concentrating these children in industrial training schools. And so that model was examined from the United States and brought back to Canada as a way of accelerating the process of this assimilative project. So it becomes more formalized in the 1880s and lasts up until 1996-97 is when the last Indian residential schools close in Canada.
And we go, thank you very much, Rolando. We go through 2003, when the government of Canada launches the National Resolution Framework. And then 5 years later is the genesis of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in June 2008. What was expected at that time? What was going on at that time? And what was the mandate for this Truth and Reconciliation Commission in Canada?
Thank you. So yeah, my interest comes in and around this time. So the Truth and Reconciliation Commission was established as part of the Indian Residential School Settlement Agreement, as you mentioned. And that agreement was really the culmination of the efforts of the survivors, the adult, child survivors of these residential schools, to gain a measure of accountability through the Canadian court system. So there was a number of lawsuits and class action lawsuits against both the federal government and the churches to get financial compensation and some measure of accountability. Seeing sort of the circumstances, this agreement was to settle all of those claims collectively and also provide for a compensation mechanism for individuals who had not brought their own lawsuits. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission was part of that settlement agreement, and the objective was to create a historical record. And I kind of pause there because it's at once obvious to me, as a legal practitioner, and also somebody from my background being from Central America and a country that has its own civil war. Truth, or the realities of these residential schools, have been largely unknown to the non-Indigenous community for likely the whole history of this country. And if they were known by few people, or they were dismissed. So it wasn't part of the narrative of what it meant to be Canadian. When we think of Canadian, at least in Canada, and the image that is tried to project around the world, peacekeepers, peace-loving people, people who like diversity, friendly people, And it's kind of hard to reconcile the idea that such a people would send children, apprehend them from their families, and put them into these residential schools where they suffered, physical and emotional, psychological abuse, were neglected, were used as child labor, were experimented on by medical officials. It's hard to reconcile those two ideas. So the idea of the TRC was really to have the survivors provide that oral testimony, do the necessary archival work, and bring together all of that information so as a testament to the Canadian public and to the world that there is a kind of reckoning with our own past. And then ultimately to create a historical record so that this society would not be permitted to go down the same path, either by claiming ignorance, right? Or, and saying we didn't know. And then using that record to say, if in the event that such policies are proposed in the future, to say, no, we've been down this path, we're not doing it again.
Well, thank you. We'll take a short break. We'll be back from Canada with Rolando Aguilera, an attorney specialized on all these issues, and he is unpacking for us a very serious and traumatic part of history of Canada that is in process of resolution. We'll be right back.
We are strong, we are resilient, and we will get through this together. But these are stressful times, and it's important to also practice good self-care. It's normal to feel overwhelmed, anxious, or afraid, but there is hope. Reach out to someone, connect with your friends, stay in touch with your community, and know that you are not alone. Learn more at wearebroadcasters.com/hope. Furnished by the National Association of Broadcasters and this station.
Aprovechamos esta oportunidad para saludar a 3 de nuestras estaciones en Estados Unidos: Akuku Media Maui en Hawái, Urbana TV Canal 6 en Illinois y Belmont Media Center en Massachusetts. Gracias por tenernos en su programación. Well, we're back talking about residential schools in Canada with Rolando Aguilera. He joins us from London, Ontario, Canada. And I have to ask you, Rolando, the recent discoveries of unmarked graves have horrified the public in Canada and around the world, spurred indigenous groups and lawyers to demand that the police investigates the Canadian government, the churches, and individual perpetrators. And there's a talk about facing a very substantial criminal investigation and legal process. Tell us a little bit about what's going on in that realm right now in Canada.
Yeah, it's quite a unique moment. I think that the non-Indigenous population, which is, coming to terms with these discoveries. And I frame it that way because, as you kind of alluded to previously, these are realities that the Indigenous peoples, the communities, and the survivors of these schools had given testimony to, even before the beginning of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission mandate in 2008. Naturally, people lived with this reality. And when I mean this reality, I mean the reality that children died while at school and that they were buried at these schools in large numbers. It's during the Truth and Reconciliation Commission process, when testimony is being received, where the magnitude of the phenomena becomes so telling that the commissioners actually go back to the government from which they get their mandate and ask for additional funding for the purposes of collecting more testimony, for the purposes of examining the archival records of the respective schools and the government, and they're denied that additional funding. And it was, I think it was in the tune of about $1 million. The report concludes, so one volume of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, volume number 4, is dedicated to unmarked graves. And again, this was not contemplated at the outset, but after receiving all this testimony was included. The report is issued in 2015, and here we are in 2001 when a community out in Kamloops, British Columbia, which is on the opposite side of the continent from where I'm from, reveals that it has contracted radar imaging, to scan the former site of the residential schools, and lo and behold, 215 bodies are recovered. And it sends a shockwave across the country and indeed across the world. The degree to which the international press took hold of this story, I think, was quite significant. And you saw an outpouring of grief from the non-Indigenous community, and a sense of re-traumatization by Indigenous communities themselves. And what's the survivors and advocates, Indigenous advocates say, you need to hold on to your seat because there's going to be more. And sure enough, about 10 days later, Kawasas First Nation in Saskatchewan revealed that it had discovered about 751 remains. And there are unique details to each of these sort of unmarked graves that we would require a lot more time to get into. But just to give you a general sense that the reason that they're partly shocking, the numbers, is that children died at the schools, and this is recorded in the TRC reports. They died because of malnutrition. They died because of poor ventilation system that facilitated the spread of tuberculosis at rates disproportional of non-Indigenous students who were going to school at the same time. Very poorly designed schools that would be susceptible to fire, and children died. So disease and that sort of thing. But children gave testimonies of the kinds of corporal punishment that they were subjected to. Like one of the survivors said, one of these nuns, one day my friend was throwing a rock at the fence, and when he was entering the school, she hit him on the head with a 2x4. 2 days later, he was dead, and I was required to bury him in the grave on the school property. So there are certainly a number of students who died because of health conditions and disease. Not by accident, though, as I just mentioned, these were poorly constructed and underfunded schools. As we say schools in quotation marks. But also, there's not enough information, and maybe there is, they would be curious to see about even the absence of record keeping about children like the one I've mentioned. Who's going to document the assault of a child that leads to their death? So it would be interesting to see how these things are recorded or not, because we've only come, and last week there was another school grave site that was revealed, and there's a total of 139 schools across the country. So the numbers could be quite significant.
Well, thank you very much. This is certainly a very complex issue, and yes, it did send shockwaves throughout Canada and around the world. We hear the term of cultural genocide used often about this situation in general of residential schools. Please tell us if, in your opinion, the residential school system amount to a cultural genocide that has been perpetrated to multi-generations of Native Americans. What are your thoughts about it, please?
Yeah, this is, so because I'm a lawyer, we are trained to deal with terms in, all terms are subject to interpretation, right? So if we look at the Genocide Convention, which is a convention that was ultimately adopted by the United Nations. Raphael Lemkin was the author of this convention, and they went through a series of modifications. Cultural genocide was actually listed as one of those heads of or phenomena that would qualify as cultural, as genocide. The final version excludes cultural genocide, and so it would be interesting to try to understand, who opposed it, who opposed the inclusion of this provision, this characterization in the ultimate version of the convention, and why. My instinct at this moment is that because many states may have opened themselves up to the accusation that they themselves had undertaken this project of cultural genocide. So you're right. So the term cultural genocide is prevalent in the discourse in Canada, and in the absence of using the term genocide was a way of describing the phenomena that took place, right? The taking of children for the purposes of turning these Indigenous children into white people. And that's not my language. That's the language of the Prime Minister of Canada in the parliamentary debates that are recorded, to kill the Indian and in the child. This is not, again, these are not secrets. These are a matter of public record. And so I think the word cultural genocide was used in order to describe that phenomenon, in order to avoid potentially falling into the trap of being accused of using a legal term where one doesn't apply, and to distract from the facts. Now, I think what I'm witnessing, at least in my very cursory analysis of media, social media discourse around what's coming to light now, we see a lot of people using the word genocide full stop. And we see even politicians in Canada using the word genocide full stop. And I mean, people who are being advised very closely, very careful how they use the words. And I think, again, I make no conclusions one way or the other. I'm not an expert in international law. But what I think is interesting, or what I think is important to think about, is what has motivated the change in language. And when you start to see mass graves in the amounts that we are seeing, and we've only had 3 out of 139 schools, I think there's a sense that we're going to see greater and greater numbers across the country. Alongside this, the stripping away of the word cultural for cultural genocide, I've seen a lot of language around concentration camps. So these are called Indian residential schools. That's what they were called. You see this kind of effort to really say, well, what else are we supposed to call them? They are peoples who are concentrated in a given place and who had rates of fatality at higher levels. They were subjected to forced labor. They were abused and neglected. Some of them never returned home. So anyways, as from a different perspective, I find it very interesting that there is this willingness and there's a movement to really more accurately, an attempt to more accurately describe what happened in these places.
Rolando, there is a great transformation going on in Canada right now. There is a ray of hope that many more people are even paying greater attention to this process. Tell us your impressions about that.
Yeah, it's I think what I like to call to mind is that the things that we know now are a result of the advocacy, the bravery, the courage, the long suffering of Indigenous peoples who never gave up, who proceeded along a path of truth. And the historical record that has been established is as a result of their efforts. We are enlightened because of what they never failed to strive for, which was, a clarification, a reckoning of the past. And this past Canada Day, July 1st, we saw movements across the country in which non-Indigenous peoples, in masses, in the city I live in, they're estimating at least 10,000 people who came in support of a contemplation, a moment of of meditation, of trying to think a new way of doing things. So all of these efforts, I think, are quite obvious to me, the efforts of these indigenous, communities, activists, the mothers, grandmothers, fathers and uncles. And I think we're starting to see a responsiveness on behalf of the non-indigenous communities, whereas before, and still today, still to a degree, but whereas before there was a outright dismissal and denial. So there is a moment of hope, I think.
Thank you very much. It's been a real pleasure to have you in the show, and we look forward to speaking with you in the future, and keep us updated with the progress of this very traumatic process that Canada is going through. Thank you very much, Rolando. Hope to have you back again.
Thank you so much. The pleasure was all mine.
Es difícil imaginar cómo un sistema de gobierno y algunas instituciones religiosas puedan cerrar la brecha de injusticia y dolor de 125 años que impactaron la vida de 150,000 niños y niñas de esas 139 escuelas residenciales. La última se cerró recién en 1996. La niñez y adolescencia de aquellos nativos americanos entre 4 y 16 años no solamente impactaron a ellos directamente, pero también a sus padres, comunidades y a sus generaciones más allá de la inmediata que sufrió esta tremenda injusticia. Canadá vive una experiencia difícil acompañado por un pueblo que en su gran mayoría quiere un proceso de sanidad y justicia profundo. Lo pasado está atrás, solo tenemos el futuro para hacer los cambios y enmendar injusticias. Hasta una próxima oportunidad, cuando juntos exploremos una vez más el ADN de las noticias. Gracias por el privilegio de su compañía.